What's up, guys? Joe Bennett here, Redcon 1 head trainer, covering a controversial subject. Controversial because I'm going to talk about the squat, and maybe aside from the bench press, this is the exercise I found people are the most emotionally attached to. So we're going to discuss today 3 different options for a squat. Obviously there's a lot more variations than that, but I'm kind of lumping it into 3 categories. First one we're going to show in a minute is going to be one more for hip dominant. So if your goal is to develop more glutes, hamstrings, adductors, we're going to show one where if your goal is to have something that's more quad dominant, and then we're going to show one that's kind of in between, which would be your best option again if you're actually a competitive powerlifter, or if your goal is really just to use as much lower body musculature at once. You're not really trying to bias one thing or the other. You just kind of want to use a lot of everything. This could also be if you're limited for time, maybe you only have one day for leg day, or maybe even if you're an athlete, you know, and your goal is really, again, just to recruit as much power and output as you possibly can. So the concerns we'll actually see when we go to the video are 2 things. If you're trying to bias a muscle, we're concerned with range of motion at the jointed influences, and in this case, the distance that joint is from the bar path. So that'll be a little bit more clear when we go into the different ones. But meaning if we're trying to isolate muscles around the hips or bias more muscles around the hips, like your glutes, we want as much hip range of motion as we can, and that's going to lend itself to a more hip dominant squat. If we're trying to train things more specifically around the knee, we want the knees moving as much as possible and trying to bias things a little bit more around that. So that'll be the things that we look at when we're going through the different variations of the squat. We're going to demonstrate a more hip dominant squat. So when I say hip dominant, yes, your knees are still involved, yes, your quads are still involved, but we're trying to bias or influence more muscles around the hips. Specifically here, we're going to do more glutes, hamstrings, and adductors are going to be ones involved the most. So what are we looking at? Again, 2 goals. We want as much range of motion with the hips, and we want them as far away from the bar path as possible. It's again that distance that technically makes how much does it weigh on those muscles around the joints. So I'm going to have her just thinking about pushing her hips back, and then she's going to stop just before her spine starts to round. So go ahead and do a couple more for me. So she's going to push her hips back, back, back. If you look at her hip joint right here, if she goes any lower than that, go ahead a little bit lower, you can see how her spine starts to round. You know, so once she goes to that bottom position, it's no longer traveling occurring at her hips and the muscle around the hips. It would just be things in the musculature around the spine. In addition, whenever that spine starts to move and those hips pull out of place, the muscles that attach to the hips tend to lose output and lose their ability to actually produce and contract very well. So one, you want to stop where the muscles that are actually influencing the hip actually stop. And then from there, you want to make sure that you're not going any lower just to lose hip stability as well too. All right, guys, so we're going to show here a more knee dominant squat with the goal of influencing more quads. So you'll see she's in a front squat position here. You could do the same thing with a back squat, but the goal is to have your body right as upright as possible and your knees as far forward as possible. So all she's going to be thinking here basically is just the same thing except with a different joint. So she's focusing on pushing her knees as far away from the bar as she can, so she's initiating and driving forward. And then we want as much range of motion as possible at the knee. So she's going to drive as far forward as we can and basically try and get full knee flexion where her hamstring is covering her calf. So again, we have those 2 goals if we're trying to train a muscle around the knee, we're trying to train the quads, is it's far from the bar path and it's a lot of range of motion. And then the same gauge here, once her hamstring's touching her calf, she really can't get any more range of motion at the knee. If she dropped even lower, so if she sunk in, same thing again, all that came from the spine. Not a whole lot necessarily changed here. So we want to adhere to the same rules as we want the spine staying neutral, we want the range of motion from the knee and not coming from the spine. Same thing, one of your made quad muscles attaches to your hips. So if your hips pull out of place, your spine rounds, you're going to lose output from the quads and other muscles that are still involved as well too. If you want the goal to have the knees as far forward as possible, a great way to do that is with a heel elevation as well. So all other things being the same, if you have a heel elevation, it's going to put your knees farther forward through the entire exercise and ultimately get more tension and more load on the quad. So the last one Tyler's going to show here is if squats are your sport. So sports all have parameters that you have to adhere to, rules that you have to adhere to. The rules of powerlifting basically, as every good powerlifter knows, you have to have your hip crease drop below your knee. That's when depth is the main concern. So again, well, like we did with the other 2 variations, if your concern is a body part, that really doesn't have a whole lot necessarily to do with depth. You may still hit a certain depth, but that's not necessarily the goal. So basically the difference here is normally when she lifts, she has Olympic lifting shoes with a little bit of a heel lift. So we have a little smaller heel lift here than we did with the front squat variation. And basically the difference between these 2 is we're kind of splitting the difference between her knees and her hips. So we're using a little bit of everything. We're allowing a little bit more range of motion. And now her goal is to make sure that, again, that hip crease ends up below the knee. So go ahead and just do a couple for me. one or two even a little bit slower. So if you guys will see from the side, the thing I want you guys watching in all the different videos here, and we're kind of going to show you guys with a line, is the distance that her knee and her hips are from the bar. So when it was the hip dominant, her hips were the furthest away from the bar this way. When it was knee dominant, her knees were the furthest that way. And when she's doing her sport, she wants to use all the muscles around both of those joints. It's going to kind of split the difference a little bit, and she's also going to hit the depth that she's required to hit for the sport that she competes in. So guys, again, just like every exercise, there's not necessarily a good or a bad squat. You just want to make sure that your squat variation or how you're choosing to squat matches your goals. So again, if your goal is more, glutes, hams, things like that, make sure your squat matches that. If your goal is more of knee dominance or want quad development, make sure your squat matches that. Or really, if squatting is your sport, like I said, if you're a power lifter or you're someone that just likes to go to the gym and squat as much weight as you can, or possibly an athlete or your time is limited, then you might choose a squat that's kind of a little bit in the middle and just uses as much as possible of everything.